Hello, I'm back at the Oratory of the College of the Resurrection, and I'm here to talk today about St. Cuthbert, one of the great saints of the north of England. Cuthbert lived in the 7th century from around 634 to 687, active in Northumbria, the kind of southern bits of Scotland, and down here into Yorkshire. During this time, England, and in the north in particular, was really struggling with a tension between the Celtic and Roman expressions of the faith. I think when we look back on this conflict, we often see it as a difference between the more philosophical and transcendent Roman expression versus the more immanent and kind of close connection in Celtic spirituality. I think that's a little overstated, though. I think a lot of this conflict actually had to do with organization and the way the church kind of operated. So the Celtic expression kind of operated with large centralized monasteries, often headed by the children, often the daughters of prominent noble families. The Roman model organized a little bit more around cities. It was more urban, and the monasteries formed a kind of network of evangelism and service. Now, looking back on this with hindsight from 1300 years, it's actually pretty impressive how well this tension was managed as they migrated here in the north from the more Celtic system to the more Roman system. Back to Cuthbert, he was a monk at Ripon Abbey, which is just north of here near Leeds, together with his mentor, a man named Eata. Now, after a few years at Ripon, a new abbot came, a man named Wilfrid, and we're going to hear more about him a little bit later. Wilfrid was a proponent of the Roman system, and Cuthbert and Eata were kind of Celtic, so they decided it was time for them to leave. They moved up to Melrose Abbey, far north from here. Now, Eata actually sends Cuthbert even further north to Lindisfarne. Even though they were both kind of from the Celtic party, Cuthbert's actually tasked with implementing the Roman system in Lindisfarne. He doesn't stop actually being super Celtic in terms of his practices. There's a story that he would go out at night into the North Sea at Lindisfarne and say prayers kind of in time with the ocean in the North Sea. It's not a warm sea. This was definitely a practice of kind of self-mortification. Now, around 676, Cuthbert kind of vaguely retires and goes off to be a more contemplative, solitary monk. He's called out of retirement a few years later in 684, and he's elected Bishop of Hexham. His old friend Eata is elected Bishop of Lindisfarne. They actually decide to trade spots, though. So Eata ends up in Hexham, and Cuthbert goes up to Lindisfarne. He's consecrated at York by Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury. Hopefully we'll talk about him later. And then Cuthbert ministers to the people around Lindisfarne up in the north until he dies. The story doesn't actually end there. He's buried at Lindisfarne, but Lindisfarne becomes a site of Viking raids, and in 875 the Vikings destroy the monastery. The monks take all of their most valuable possessions, including the body of Cuthbert, and they move to the mainland. They kind of travel further inland, avoiding the Vikings, and he's kind of transported in this carved wooden coffin that's really beautiful. We actually have it preserved. And he ends up in Durham around 1000. Now, along the way, after he lands in Durham, they open up his coffin and kind of build a shrine for him. And they find a bunch of stuff. They find Cuthbert himself, and he's remarkably well preserved. Some folks actually think he's well preserved because they put sand from the beach down on the bottom of his coffin, and the salt actually helped preserve his body. His pectoral cross, the actual cross that he had as a bishop, is also with him, together with a book of Gospels and also 2 pieces of 10th century Anglo-Saxon embroidery, a stole and then a maniple that I think goes around the left hand. Devotion to Cuthbert was really quite significant and important culturally as well. Alfred the Great expressed strong devotion, and the example of Cuthbert becomes this sort of unifying force. Also, kind of ironically, the Viking Danish subjects up here in the north kind of adopt him as their local saint, and he becomes very prominent for that as well. The Shrine of Cuthbert was one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in the north of England, and remained that way until the dissolution of the monasteries. In fact, it was so popular that even after all the sort of gold was stripped out, the people sort of demanded that he be kept there, and he remains at Durham Cathedral. So that's a little bit about Cuthbert, and later on I'll give you hopefully some pictures of his shrine and my thoughts and reactions of what it was like to visit Cuthbert. Further down in the cathedral itself is the shrine of St. Cuthbert. One of the things, Durham is an amazing cathedral. It's parts of it are one of the older cathedrals in England. Sort of big, solid, carved stone columns. Really kind of feels like the bones of the earth coming up and holding this place together. The shrine itself is back behind the high altar in kind of a raised section. They call it the feretory. I have no idea what that word means. It's called the feretory. There's a screen in between the high altar and the shrine, and in the Reformation, almost all of the statues that were in that screen got kind of smashed out. And there's records that the shrine itself was heavily gilded and kind of encrusted with precious jewels and all sorts of things. All that, of course, was stripped out during the Reformation, but they didn't actually remove the shrine itself. That was very, very unusual. I actually had forgotten that the head of St. Oswald, king of the Northumbrians, is also buried with Cuthbert, and I wondered if that might have had something to do with it. During the Reformation, Henry VIII was kind of all about royal prerogative, and so sometimes they were a little bit reticent to mess with relics that were from kings, so that may have given Cuthbert a bit of a pass. But of course, Cuthbert was incredibly popular in the north, and removing his body would have probably caused a riot in the city, so they didn't. The shrine itself is really now quite simple. There's a beautiful sort of painted icon above it, and a very simple stone. Carved into the stone is Cuthbertus, and there's kind of gold poured into the lettering. It's really quite simple and lovely. Around it there are spaces to kneel. I was lucky enough to be there for one of the daily prayers at the shrine, and there are a lovely set of prayers, clearly focused on pilgrims and people who are coming. Thinking of Cuthbert himself, my prayers turned frequently to his role in settling the dispute between the Celts and the Romans, and the kind of elegant compromise that came out, that they would kind of adhere to a lot of the political changes and change their practice of the date of Easter, but they would hold on to their own spiritual practices, and so many of the Celtic spiritual practices still remained. And that was really where my thoughts turned to, that as the church grows and more practices change, and in the Episcopal Church, as we look at how our practices change, that it's okay to hold on to our own our own practices and allow them to continue to feed us as we walk our journey.